The boss humiliated the washerwoman in front of everyone. 2 hours later, everyone was silent upon discovering her secret. Savannah Reeves stepped out of her beat-up Ford Taurus, the cool evening air of Millbrook, Connecticut, washing over her as she gazed up at the modest 2-story house she called home. The porch light flickered, a reminder of yet another repair she couldn't afford. At 42, Savannah's face bore the lines of a woman who had weathered more storms than she cared to count, but her eyes still held a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. As she trudged up the cracked walkway, her bones ached from a grueling 12-hour shift at Millbrook General Hospital, where she worked as a nurse's aide. It was her third job of the day, following an early morning stint at the local diner and a few hours of house cleaning for the town's more affluent residents. But Savannah didn't allow herself to dwell on the exhaustion. She had a purpose that drove her forward, with unwavering resolve. That purpose was currently hunched over a laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of textbooks and empty coffee mugs. Aria Reeves, at 20, was the spitting image of her mother. Same chestnut hair, same determined set to her jaw. But where Savannah's eyes held the weight of hard-won battles, Aria's sparkled with the promise of a future yet unwritten. "Hey, sweetie," Savannah called out, dropping her keys in the chipped ceramic bowl by the door. "Still at it?" Aria looked up, blinking as if emerging from a trance. "Oh, hi, Mom. Yeah, this sociology paper is kicking my butt." She stretched, wincing as her back popped. "How was work?" Savannah mustered a smile, pushing aside the bone-deep weariness. "Oh, you know, same old. Mrs. Hendricks is still trying to escape the geriatric ward, and I swear if I have to mop up one more spilled bedpan..." Aria laughed, the sound bringing a genuine warmth to Savannah's heart. It was moments like these that made all the long hours and aching muscles worth it. Her daughter was in her second year at Millbrook University, riding on a partial scholarship that Savannah supplemented with every spare penny she could scrape together. "I made some pasta earlier," Aria said, gesturing to a covered plate on the counter. "It's probably cold now, but..." "It's perfect," Savannah assured her, grabbing the plate and settling into the chair across from her daughter. As she ate, she couldn't help but marvel at the young woman before her. Aria had inherited not just Savannah's looks, but her tenacity and work ethic as well. Despite the challenges of growing up with a single mother, constantly working to make ends meet, Aria had thrived, excelling in her studies and never losing sight of her dreams. "So," Savannah began, trying to keep her tone casual, "have you given any more thought to that internship at the mayor's office?" Aria's shoulders tensed slightly. "Mum, we've talked about this. It's unpaid and I can't ask you to cover all my expenses while I'm not working. But it's such a great opportunity," Savannah pressed gently. "It could open so many doors for you in local government." "I know, but..." Aria trailed off, her eyes falling to the stack of bills peeking out from beneath a textbook. "We can't afford it right now, maybe next year." Savannah felt a familiar pang of guilt twist in her gut. She'd always promised herself that her daughter would have every opportunity she'd been denied, that Aria would never have to sacrifice her dreams for financial stability. And yet here they were, having the same conversation they'd had countless times before. "Honey, please don't worry about the money," Savannah said, reaching across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "We'll make it work, we always do." Aria's smile was tinged with sadness. "I know we do, Mom, but I can't keep watching you run yourself into the ground for me. It's not fair." "Life isn't always fair," Savannah replied, a hint of steel entering her voice. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for what matters. Your education, your future. That's what matters most to me." They lapsed into silence, the weight of unspoken worries settling over the small kitchen. Savannah's mind raced, trying to calculate how many extra shifts she could pick up, what expenses she could cut back on. There had to be a way to make this work for Aria. As if sensing her mother's thoughts, Aria spoke up. "I was thinking maybe I could pick up some more hours at the campus bookstore, or see if the library needs any help." Savannah shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. Your job is to focus on your studies. Leave the worrying about money to me." Aria opened her mouth to argue, but a sudden wave of dizziness washed over Savannah. The room tilted alarmingly, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Mom?" Aria's voice sounded far away. "Mom, are you okay?" Savannah blinked hard, willing the sensation to pass. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired, that's all." But as she met her daughter's worried gaze, a flicker of fear ignited in Savannah's chest. This wasn't the first time she'd experienced these dizzy spells, and lately they seemed to be happening with increasing frequency. She'd been ignoring the nagging fatigue, the unexplained bruises, telling herself it was just the result of long hours and not enough sleep. Now, looking at Arya's concerned face, Savannah wondered if she could afford to keep ignoring the warning signs her body was sending. But what choice did she have? They were barely keeping their heads above water as it was. She couldn't afford to get sick, not when Arya's future hung in the balance. "Really, I'm okay," Savannah insisted, forcing a smile. "Just need a good night's sleep. Why don't you tell me more about this sociology paper?" As Arya hesitantly began explaining her thesis, Savannah pushed her worries to the back of her mind. Whatever was going on with her health, she'd deal with it later. Right now, her daughter needed her to be strong, to be the rock she'd always been. But as the night wore on and Savannah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that their carefully balanced world was about to be turned upside down. Little did she know, the challenges they'd faced so far were merely the opening act in a drama that would test the bonds of love, forgiveness, and family in ways she could never have imagined. The early morning sunlight filtered through the threadbare curtains of Savannah's bedroom, casting a soft glow on the faded wallpaper. She stirred, her body protesting as she dragged herself out of bed. The dizziness from the night before lingered, a constant companion that she stubbornly ignored as she went through her morning routine. As she stood in front of the mirror, applying concealer to the dark circles under her eyes, Savannah's gaze fell on a small box tucked away in the corner of her dresser. With trembling hands, she opened it, revealing a collection of mementos from a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. At the top of the pile lay a faded photograph, its edges worn with time and handling. A much younger Savannah smiled back at her, her arms wrapped around a handsome man with piercing blue eyes and a roguish grin. Brock Callahan. Even now, 20 years later, the name sent a shiver down her spine. They had been so young, so in love, or so Savannah had thought. Brock was the golden boy of Millbrook, heir to a shipping fortune and charm to spare. When he'd swept Savannah off her feet, it had felt like a fairy tale come to life. But fairy tales, Savannah had learned the hard way, rarely survived contact with reality. She remembered the day she'd told Brock she was pregnant, her heart full of hope and excitement. She'd expected joy, maybe a little fear. What she hadn't expected was the cold fury that had transformed his handsome face into a mask of disgust. "Get rid of it," he'd snarled, pacing the opulent living room of his family's mansion. "I'm not throwing away my future for some kid." Savannah's world had shattered in that moment. She'd pleaded, reasoned, begged, but Brock was immovable. It was the baby or him, and when Savannah chose her unborn child, Brock had cut her out of his life as cleanly as a surgeon excising a tumor. The whispers and stares had followed her for months afterward. Millbrook was a small town, and gossip spread like wildfire. Brock's family had closed ranks, their wealth and influence ensuring that their precious heir's reputation remained unblemished. It was Savannah who bore the brunt of the scandal, labeled a gold digger and worse. But she'd persevered, drawing strength from the life growing inside her. When Arya was born, red-faced and squalling, Savannah had looked into her daughter's eyes and known that every sacrifice had been worth it. Now staring at the photograph, Savannah felt a familiar mix of anger and regret wash over her. She'd never told Arya the truth about her father. As far as her daughter knew, he'd been a college boyfriend who died in a car accident before she was born. It was easier that way, Savannah had reasoned. Better for Arya to believe she was the child of a tragic love story than the unwanted result of a rich boy's carelessness. But lately, Savannah found herself wondering if she'd made the right choice. Arya was an adult now, with a right to know her own history. And there were times in the darkest hours of the night when Savannah couldn't help but imagine how different their lives might have been if Brock had stepped up, if he'd been the man she'd once believed him to be. A soft knock at the door startled Savannah from her reverie. "Mom," Arya called. "Are you okay? You're going to be late for work." Savannah hastily shoved the photograph back into the box, slamming the drawer shut. "I'm fine, sweetie," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just running a little behind. I'll be out in a minute." As she finished getting ready, Savannah pushed thoughts of Brock and the past firmly aside. She had no time for what-ifs and might-have-beens. The present demanded all of her attention and energy, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Savannah hurried out the door, she had no way of knowing that the carefully constructed walls between her past and present were about to come crumbling down. The diner was bustling when Savannah arrived, already 10 minutes late for her shift. Louisa, the owner, shot her a disapproving look as she hurried behind the counter to don her apron. "Sorry, Lou," Savannah mumbled, tying the strings with practiced ease. "Overslept." Louisa's stern expression softened slightly. "You're working yourself to the bone, girl. When's the last time you took a day off?" Savannah managed a wry smile. "I'll rest when Aria's got her degree in hand." She dove into the morning rush, refilling coffee cups and taking orders with the efficiency of long practice. But as the hours wore on, Savannah found herself struggling to keep up. The dizziness from the day before returned with a vengeance, accompanied by a deep, bone-aching fatigue that made every step feel like wading through molasses. It was during the mid-morning lull that disaster struck. Savannah was carrying a tray loaded with plates to a corner booth when the room suddenly tilted. She stumbled, fighting to regain her balance, but it was too late. The tray slipped from her grasp, sending a cacophony of shattering porcelain echoing through the diner. For a moment, Savannah could only stare at the mess in horror. Then, as if in slow motion, she felt her knees give way. The last thing she heard before darkness claimed her was Louisa's panicked voice calling her name. When Savannah came to, she found herself lying on a gurney in the emergency room of Millbrook General. The irony of being a patient in the very hospital where she worked wasn't lost on her. "Miss Reeves?" A familiar voice drew her attention. Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of the attending physicians, stood at the foot of the bed, her expression grave. "How are you feeling?" Savannah struggled to sit up, wincing at the pounding in her head. "I'm fine," she insisted automatically. "Just a little dizzy spell. I can go back to work." Dr. Vasquez held up a hand, cutting her off. "Savannah, I've known you for years. You're one of the hardest workers in this hospital. But right now you need to listen to me as your doctor, not your colleague." A chill ran down Savannah's spine at the seriousness in the other woman's tone. "What's wrong with me?" "We've run some preliminary tests," Dr. Vasquez began, her voice gentle but firm. "Your blood work is showing some concerning abnormalities. I'd like to admit you for further testing, but Savannah, I think we may be looking at a serious condition, possibly leukemia." The word hit Savannah like a physical blow. Leukemia, cancer. It couldn't be possible. She didn't have time to be sick, not with Aria's tuition due and bills piling up, and "No," she said, shaking her head vehemently. "There has to be some mistake. I can't have cancer." Dr. Vasquez's expression was sympathetic but unyielding. "I know this is a shock, but we need to run more tests to confirm the diagnosis and determine the best course of treatment. The sooner we start, the better your chances." "You don't understand," Savannah interrupted, panic rising in her throat. "I can't be admitted. I have to work. My daughter, her tuition, I can't afford." "Savannah," Dr. Vasquez's voice was firm. "Listen to me. Your health has to come first. We'll figure out the rest, but right now, you need to focus on getting well." As the reality of her situation began to sink in, Savannah felt tears welling up in her eyes. How was she going to tell Aria? How could she possibly afford the treatment? And most terrifying of all, what if she didn't make it? What would happen to her daughter then? In that moment, lying in the sterile hospital room with the weight of an uncertain future pressing down on her, Savannah Reeves felt more alone than she had in 20 years. Little did she know, the wheels of fate were already in motion, setting the stage for a reunion that would change everything. Aria Reeves paced the small waiting room of Millbrook General, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribcage. The call from the diner had come just as she was leaving her morning class. Louisa's panicked voice explaining that her mother had collapsed and been taken to the hospital. Now, as she waited for news, Aria's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Her mother had always been the picture of strength, working multiple jobs without complaint, never letting on if she was tired or unwell. To see her brought low like this, it was unthinkable. Aria, She whirled at the sound of her name, coming face to face with Dr. Vasquez. The older woman's kind eyes were shadowed with concern, and Arya felt her stomach drop. "How is she? Can I see her?" Dr. Vasquez gestured for Arya to sit, taking the chair beside her. "Your mother is stable," she began, her voice gentle, "but I'm afraid we've found some irregularities in her blood work." As the doctor explained the situation, the suspected leukemia, the need for further tests and likely intensive treatment, Arya felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Her mother, her rock, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her a better life. How could this be happening? "She's asking for you," Dr. Vasquez said, squeezing Arya's shoulder. "Try to stay calm for her, okay? She's going to need your strength." Arya nodded numbly, following the doctor down the sterile hallway to her mother's room. When she saw Savannah, pale and small in the hospital bed, it took every ounce of willpower Arya possessed not to break down. "Mum," she whispered, rushing to Savannah's side and grasping her hand. Savannah's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile tugging at her lips. "Hey, sweetie, I'm sorry to worry you." Arya shook her head fiercely. "Don't apologize. You're going to be fine. We'll get through this together, okay?" As they talked, Arya's mind whirred, already calculating and planning. She knew the astronomical costs associated with cancer treatment, even with insurance. Their meager savings wouldn't come close to covering it. "Mom," Arya said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm going to take a break from school, just for a semester or two. I can work full-time, help with the medical bills." "Absolutely not," Savannah interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been moments before. "You are not sacrificing your education. I won't allow it." "But Mom—" "No buts," Savannah insisted. "We'll figure something out. Maybe I can get a loan or—" Arya's heart clenched at the worry lines etched deep in her mother's face. Even now, lying in a hospital bed facing a terrifying diagnosis, Savannah's first concern was for her daughter's future. In that moment, Arya made a silent vow. She would find a way to help, with or without her mother's blessing. Savannah had spent the last 20 years putting Arya first. Now it was Arya's turn to do the same for her mother. As visiting hours came to an end and Arya reluctantly prepared to leave, she kissed her mother's forehead. "Get some rest, Mom. I'll be back first thing in the morning." Savannah nodded, already drifting off to sleep. Arya lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her mother's chest. Then, squaring her shoulders, she headed out into the cool evening air, determination burning in her eyes. The next few days passed in a blur of tests, consultations, and mounting worry. The diagnosis was confirmed, acute myeloid leukemia, and the treatment plan laid out. Chemotherapy would need to begin immediately, followed by potential stem cell transplants if a suitable donor could be found. Arya threw herself into research, spending every spare moment between classes and hospital visits, poring over medical journals and patient forums. She became an expert on her mother's condition, peppering the doctors with questions and taking meticulous notes on treatment options and side effects. But as the first round of chemotherapy began and the medical bills started rolling in, the harsh reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs were staggering. Arya watched helplessly as her mother's hard-earned savings dwindled, knowing it wouldn't be nearly enough. It was during one of her late-night research sessions, bleary-eyed and caffeine-fueled, that Arya stumbled across an ad that would change everything. Wanted. Full-time housekeeper for Oak Ridge Manor. Room and board provided, competitive salary, inquire within. Oak Ridge Manor. Even Arya, who had grown up on the wrong side of the tracks in Millbrook, knew of the sprawling estate on the outskirts of town. It was the ancestral home of the Callahan family, one of the wealthiest and most influential clans in the state. The salary mentioned in the ad was more than Arya had ever dreamed of making. With room and board provided, she could put almost every penny towards her mother's medical expenses. It was perfect. Almost too perfect. There was just one problem. Taking the job would mean putting her education on hold, exactly what her mother had forbidden her to do. Arya's finger hovered over the mouse, her heart pounding. She thought of her mother, lying in that hospital bed, still trying to protect her daughter's future even as her own hung in the balance. "I'm sorry, Mum," Arya whispered, "but this time I have to do what's best for both of us." With a deep breath, she clicked apply, setting in motion a chain of events that would unravel decades of secrets and forever alter the course of 3 intertwined lives. The next morning, Arya steeled herself as she entered her mother's hospital room. Savannah was sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert, a book open on her lap. "Morning, sweetheart." Savannah greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're here early." Arya took a deep breath. "Mom, we need to talk." She explained about the job at Oak Ridge Manor, laying out her reasoning as calmly and logically as she could. As expected, Savannah's reaction was immediate and vehement. "Absolutely not," she said, shaking her head. "Arya, your education is everything. I won't let you throw away your future for me." "I'm not throwing anything away," Arya countered. "It's just a temporary break. I can go back to school once you're better, and we've got the medical bills under control." They argued back and forth, voices rising until a nurse poked her head in to check on them. Finally exhausted, Savannah slumped back against her pillows. "You're just like your father," she murmured, so quietly Arya almost missed it. "So damn stubborn." Arya froze. Her mother rarely spoke of her father, and never with such... Was that bitterness in her voice? But before she could question it, Savannah sighed heavily. "I can see I'm not going to talk you out of this. But promise me, Arya, promise me you'll go back to school as soon as you can." Arya nodded, relief washing over her. "I promise, Mum. And hey, who knows? Maybe working at Oak Ridge Manor will be an education in itself." As she left the hospital that day, Arya felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. She had no way of knowing that her new job would lead her straight into the heart of a family drama 2 decades in the making, or that the next time she set foot in Oak Ridge Manor, her entire world would be turned upside down. The gravel driveway crunched under Arya's worn sneakers as she made her way up to Oak Ridge Manor. The sprawling Victorian mansion loomed before her, its gabled roof and intricate woodwork a testament to a bygone era of wealth and privilege. Arya's palms were sweaty as she raised her hand to knock on the imposing front door. This was it, the first step towards securing her mother's future. She couldn't afford to mess this up. The door swung open, revealing a stern-faced woman in her 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. "You must be Arya," she said, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Arya's appearance. "I'm Mrs. Holbrook, the head housekeeper. Come in." Arya followed Mrs. Holbrook through the cavernous foyer, trying not to gawk at the crystal chandeliers and priceless artwork that adorned every surface. It was like stepping into another world, one far removed from the modest 2-bedroom house she shared with her mother. "The Callahans are very particular about their staff," Mrs. Holbrook was saying as she led Arya through a maze of hallways. "I hope you're prepared for hard work, girl, for this isn't a job for the faint of heart." "I'm not afraid of hard work, ma'am," Arya assured her. "My mum raised me to give my all to everything I do." Something in Mrs. Holbrook's expression softened slightly at the mention of Arya's mother. "Yes, well, we'll see. Now let me show you to your room." The room turned out to be a small but comfortable space in the servants' quarters, with a narrow bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the manicured gardens. It was more than Arya had dared to hope for. As Mrs. Holbrook ran through Arya's duties, cleaning, laundry, helping in the kitchen when needed, Arya's mind wandered to her mother. Savannah was due to start her second round of chemo soon, and the thought of not being there to hold her hand made Arya's chest tight with guilt. "Are you listening, girl?" Mrs. Holbrook's sharp voice snapped Arya back to attention. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, it won't happen again." Mrs. Holbrook's eyes narrowed. "See that it doesn't. Now get changed into your uniform. You start immediately." As Arya donned the simple black dress and white apron that would be her uniform for the foreseeable future, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror above the dresser. For a moment, she hardly recognized the young woman staring back at her. Gone was the carefree college student. In her place stood a determined young woman ready to shoulder the weight of adult responsibilities. "I can do this," Arya whispered to her reflection, "for Mom." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Arya threw herself into her new role. She scrubbed floors until her hands were raw, learned the intricacies of polishing silver, and memorized the Callahans' exacting standards for everything from how to fold a napkin to the precise temperature at which to serve afternoon tea. Through it all, she caught only fleeting glimpses of the family she served. There was Constance Callahan, the family matriarch, a regal woman in her 70s who ruled Oakridge Manor with an iron fist. Then there were the two younger Callahan women, Brock's sisters, Arya assumed, who flitted in and out of the house in a cloud of designer perfume and barely concealed disdain for the staff. But it was Brock Callahan himself who captured Arya's attention. She'd seen him only from a distance, a tall figure with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence that seemed to fill any room he entered. There was something about him that nagged at the edges of Arya's consciousness, a sense of familiarity she couldn't quite place. It was on her 5th day at Oakridge Manor that Arya's world tilted on its axis. She was dusting in the library, a cavernous room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, when the door swung open. Arya turned, expecting to see Mrs. Holbrook with some new task. Instead, she found herself face to face with Brock Callahan himself. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Arya felt her breath catch in her throat as she took in the man's features up close for the first time. The sharp angle of his jaw, the curve of his nose, the intense blue of his eyes. It was like looking in a mirror. Brock's expression shifted from mild curiosity to shock as he took in Arya's appearance. The feather duster slipped from Arya's suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the hardwood floor. I'm sorry, sir," Arya stammered, bending to retrieve the duster. "I didn't mean to disturb you." But Brock didn't seem to hear her. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "What did you say your name was?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Arya, sir. Arya Reeves." The color drained from Brock's face. "Reeves," he repeated. "Your mother, is her name Savannah?" Arya nodded slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Brock must be able to hear it. "How did you know that?" Brock stumbled back, gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. "My God," he whispered. "It can't be." In that moment, the pieces clicked into place. The sense of familiarity, the shared features, her mother's reticence to speak about her father. Arya felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. "You're my father," she said, the words falling from her lips like stones. Brock's silence was all the confirmation she needed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The ticking of the antique clock on the mantel seemed deafening in the charged silence of the library. Finally, Brock cleared his throat. "Arya, this is quite a shock. I had no idea." "No idea?" Arya's voice rose, anger suddenly burning through her shock. "You had no idea you had a daughter? Did you even bother to check on my mother after you abandoned her?" Brock flinched as if he'd been struck. "It's complicated. Your mother and I, we were young. There were expectations, family pressures." "Save it," Arya spat, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I don't want to hear your excuses. Do you have any idea what my mother went through? How hard she worked to give me a good life while you were living in luxury?" Shame flickered across Brock's face. "Arya, please. I know I have a lot to answer for, but maybe this is a chance for us to—" "A chance?" Arya laughed bitterly. "You had 20 years of chances. I don't need a father now, and neither does my mother." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the library, leaving a stunned Brock in her wake. She made it halfway down the hall before the tears started to fall, hot and angry, streaking down her cheeks. How could this be happening? How could the man she'd been silently resenting her entire life, the faceless specter of the father who'd abandoned them, turn out to be her employer? It was like something out of a bad soap opera. Arya's mind raced as she tried to process this earth-shattering revelation. Should she quit? Call her mother and tell her everything? The thought of keeping this secret from Savannah made her stomach churn, but the idea of adding this stress to her mother's already fragile condition was equally unthinkable. As she reached the servants' staircase, Arya made a decision. She would stay, at least for now. The job at Oakridge Manor was still her best chance at helping her mother, regardless of who signed the checks. And if Brock Callahan thought he could waltz into her life and play daddy after 20 years of absence, he had another thing coming. Little did Arya know, her world was about to become even more complicated. For in the coming days, as the shock of their encounter rippled through Oakridge Manor, long-buried secrets would rise to the surface, forcing Arya, Brock, and Savannah to confront the painful past they all shared, and perhaps find a way forward together. The days following Arya's confrontation with Brock passed in a haze of tension and unspoken words. Arya threw herself into her work with renewed vigor, scrubbing and polishing as if she could somehow erase the turmoil in her heart through sheer physical exertion. Brock, for his part, seemed to be avoiding her. Arya caught glimpses of him hurrying out of rooms as she entered, his face a mask of guilt and uncertainty. Part of her was relieved. She wasn't ready to face him again, to hear whatever justifications or explanations he might offer. But another part, a small, traitorous voice in the back of her mind, couldn't help but wonder about the man who was her father. It was Mrs. Holbrook who finally broke the stalemate. The head housekeeper cornered Arya in the laundry room, her usually stern face softened with concern. "All right, girl," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "Out with it. What's going on between you and Mr. Callahan?" Arya's hands stilled on the shirt she was ironing. "I don't know what you mean," she mumbled, avoiding Mrs. Holbrook's piercing gaze. "Don't play dumb with me," Mrs. Holbrook chided. "I've worked in this house for 30 years. I know when something's amiss. And ever since you two had your little tete-a-tete in the library, this place has been as tense as a coiled spring." Arya sighed, setting down the iron. She'd come to respect Mrs. Holbrook over the past week, appreciating the older woman's no-nonsense approach and hidden kindness. Maybe it would help to confide in someone. "He's my father," Arya said quietly. "I didn't know it when I took this job, but Brock Callahan is my biological father, Mrs." Holbrook's eyebrows shot up, disappearing beneath her silver bangs. "Well, I'll be damned," she muttered. Then, to Arya's surprise, she let out a soft chuckle. "I always wondered about that summer fling of his. Looks like it came back to bite him in the ass." Arya blinked, taken aback by Mrs. Holbrook's reaction. "You knew about my mother?" The older woman nodded, her expression turning somber. "I remember your mother, Savannah. Sweet girl, worked here one summer as a maid. She and Brock were inseparable, but then suddenly she was gone. Brock was in a foul mood for months afterward. I always suspected there was more to the story." Arya felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Anger at Brock for keeping this secret, curiosity about her parents' past, and a strange sort of relief at finally knowing the truth. Did he ever mention her again?" she asked hesitantly. Mrs. Holbrook's eyes softened. "Not directly, no. But sometimes late at night I'd find him in the library, looking at old photographs. There was always such sadness in his eyes. I think he regretted whatever happened between them." Harriet absorbed this information, her mind whirling. The image of Brock as the callous abandoner she'd always imagined was beginning to blur, replaced by something more complex and human. "What are you going to do now?" Mrs. Holbrook asked gently. Arya squared her shoulders. "I'm going to keep working. My mother needs this job, needs the money for her treatment. I can't let my feelings about Brock get in the way of that." Mrs. Holbrook nodded approvingly. "You're a strong one, just like your mother. But Arya, don't close your heart completely. Sometimes the past has a way of working itself out if we let it." With those cryptic words, Mrs. Holbrook left Arya to her thoughts. As she mechanically folded laundry, Arya's mind drifted to her mother. Savannah was due for another round of chemo tomorrow, and Arya ached to be there with her. But she'd promised to call to be there in spirit if not in person. Later that evening, as Arya was finishing up her duties in the main hall, she overheard raised voices coming from Brock's study. Curiosity got the better of her, and she crept closer to the door, straining to hear. "Can't just ignore this, Brock." It was Constance Callahan, her usually cool voice tight with anger. "A love child? Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation?" "Keep your voice down, Mother," Brock replied, his tone weary. "Arya is my daughter, whether you like it or not. And I want to make things right." "Make things right?" Constance scoffed. "You can't seriously be considering acknowledging her. Think of the scandal, the damage to the company." "Enough!" Brock's voice cracked like a whip. "I've spent 20 years regretting the biggest mistake of my life. I lost the woman I loved and the chance to know my own child. because I was too much of a coward to stand up to you and Father. Well, not anymore. Arya's heart pounded in her chest. The woman he loved? Had Brock truly cared for her mother? And what about Savannah? Constance demanded. Have you even bothered to find out what happened to her? There was a long pause before Brock spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. She's sick, Mother. Leukemia. Arya took this job to help pay for her treatment. Arya gasped, then clapped a hand over her mouth. How had Brock found out about her mother's condition? Well, Constance said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, isn't that convenient? I suppose next you'll be offering to pay for her medical bills? As a matter of fact, yes, Brock replied firmly. It's the least I can do after everything I've put them through. Arya couldn't bear to hear anymore. She fled down the hall, her mind reeling. Brock wanted to acknowledge her, to help her mother. It was too much to process. As she reached her small room in the servants' quarters, Arya's phone buzzed with a text. It was from the hospital. Her mother's condition had taken a turn for the worse. They needed her there immediately. Panic clawed at Arya's throat. She had to get to the hospital, but how? She didn't have a car and the last bus into town had already left. Before she could think better of it, Arya found herself running back towards Brock's study. She burst through the door without knocking, startling both Brock and Constance. I'm sorry to interrupt, she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. But I need to get to the hospital. My mum, she's not doing well. Brock's face paled. Without hesitation, he grabbed his keys from the desk. I'll drive you, he said, already moving towards the door. Brock, Constance protested. You can't just... Not now, Mother. Brock cut her off. He turned to Arya, his blue eyes, so like her own, filled with determination. Let's go. As they raced through the night towards Millbrook General, Arya found herself in the surreal position of sitting next to her newfound father, united in their concern for the woman they both loved in very different ways. She didn't know what the future held, or how this tangled web of family drama would resolve itself. But in that moment, speeding towards an uncertain future, Arya felt a tiny spark of hope ignite in her chest. Little did she know the events of the coming days would test the bonds of family, love, and forgiveness in ways none of them could have imagined. The harsh fluorescent lights of Millbrook General's ICU cast a sickly glow over Savannah's pale face. Arya sat by her mother's bedside, clutching her hand, while Brock hovered uncertainly in the doorway. Mom, Arya whispered, her voice choked with tears. Mom, please, you have to fight. Savannah's eyelids fluttered and she turned her head slightly towards her daughter's voice. Arya, she murmured weakly. What are you doing here? You should be at work. Shh, don't worry about that now, Arya soothed, smoothing her mother's hair back from her forehead. I'm right where I need to be. Savannah's gaze drifted past Arya, focusing on the figure in the doorway. Her eyes widened in shock. Brock, she breathed, disbelief coloring her voice. Is that really you? Brock stepped into the room, his face a mask of guilt and concern. Hello, Savannah, he said softly. It's been a long time. Arya watched as a myriad of emotions flickered across her mother's face. Surprise, anger, longing, and finally, a bone-deep weariness. Why are you here, Brock? Savannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Brock could answer, Dr. Vasquez entered the room, her expression grave. Ms. Reeves, Arya. She nodded to each of them before turning to Brock with a questioning look. He's my father, Arya explained, the words still feeling foreign on her tongue. Dr. Vasquez's eyebrows rose slightly, but she quickly composed herself. I see. Well, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. The latest round of chemotherapy hasn't been as effective as we'd hoped. Savannah's body is struggling to fight off a severe infection. Arya felt her world tilt on its axis. What does that mean? She asked, her voice small and frightened. Dr. Vasquez's eyes were compassionate but direct. It means we need to consider more aggressive treatment options. There's a new immunotherapy trial that's shown promising results in cases like Savannah's. But... She hesitated, glancing between Arya and Brock. But what? Brock pressed. It's extremely expensive, Dr. Vasquez admitted, and it's not covered by standard insurance. Arya felt her heart sink. They were already drowning in medical bills. How could they possibly afford an experimental treatment? But before she could voice her despair, Brock stepped forward. "Cost is not an issue," he said firmly. "Whatever Savannah needs, I'll pay for it. All of it." Savannah's eyes widened in shock. "Brock, no, you can't." "I can and I will," Brock interrupted gently. He moved to Savannah's other side, taking her free hand in his. "Savannah, I know I have no right to waltz back into your life after all this time. But please, let me do this. Let me try to make up for some of the hurt I've caused." Arya watched in amazement as tears welled up in her mother's eyes. "Oh, Brock," Savannah whispered. "You stubborn, impossible man." "Doctor," Vasquez cleared her throat. "Well, if finances aren't an obstacle, I'd like to start Savannah on the trial as soon as possible. I'll get the paperwork started." As the doctor left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Arya looked between her parents, marveling at the complex web of emotions that seemed to stretch between them. Finally, Savannah spoke. "Arya, honey, could you give your father and me a moment alone?" Arya hesitated, reluctant to leave her mother's side, but something in Savannah's eyes, a mixture of determination and vulnerability, made her nod. "Of course, Mom. I'll just be outside if you need me." As Arya stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind her, she leaned against the wall, her mind whirling. How had her life changed so drastically in such a short time? Just weeks ago, she'd been a normal college student, her biggest worries centered around exams and term papers. Now here she was, watching her long-lost father reunite with her gravely ill mother. Through the small window in the door, Arya could see Brock and Savannah talking intently. There were tears, nods, and at one point, Brock brought Savannah's hand to his lips in a gesture so tender, it made Arya's heart ache. As the minutes ticked by, Arya found herself imagining a future she'd never dared to dream of before. A future where her mother was healthy, where she had two parents who loved her, where the weight of the world didn't rest solely on her young shoulders. But could such a future really exist? Could 2 decades of pain and absence truly be bridged? When the door finally opened, Arya straightened up, searching her parents' faces for clues. To her surprise, both Savannah and Brock were smiling, though their eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Arya," Savannah called softly, "come here, sweetheart. Your father and I have a lot to tell you." As Arya settled into the chair between her parents, Brock began to speak. He told her of the whirlwind summer romance he'd had with Savannah all those years ago, of the pressure he'd faced from his family to focus on his future and the family business. He spoke of his cowardice in letting Savannah go, of the regret that had haunted him every day since. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing," Brock said, his voice heavy with remorse, "that you and your mother would be better off without me and all the complications my family would bring. But I was wrong, so terribly wrong." Savannah squeezed his hand. "We both made mistakes," she said softly. "I was too proud to ask for help, too hurt to reach out even when things were at their worst." Arya listened, tears streaming down her face, as her parents laid bare the past she'd never known. And as they spoke of the future, of treatments and recovery, of building bridges and healing old wounds, she felt something shift inside her. It wouldn't be easy. There were still hurts to heal, trusts to rebuild, but for the first time Arya allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could become the family she'd always dreamed of. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the hospital windows, Arya found herself enveloped in a three-way hug, her parents' arms strong and sure around her. In that moment, surrounded by love and the promise of a new beginning, Arya knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Epilogue. 1 year later, the garden of Oak Ridge Manor was a riot of color, flowers in full bloom under the warm summer sun. Laughter and the clink of champagne glasses filled the air as guests mingled on the manicured lawn. At the center of it all stood Savannah and Brock, hand in hand, their faces glowing with happiness. Savannah, her hair growing back in soft curls after her final round of treatment, looked radiant in a simple white sundress. Brock, his arm protectively around her waist, couldn't seem to take his eyes off her. Arya watched her parents from across the garden, a smile playing on her lips. The past year had been a whirlwind of changes, challenges, and ultimately, triumphs. Her mother's battle with leukemia had been long and difficult, but with the experimental treatment Brock had funded and the unwavering support of her newfound family, Savannah had beaten the odds. Just last month, she'd been declared cancer-free. As for Arya herself, she'd returned to university, this time with a full scholarship courtesy of her father. But her experiences had changed her. She'd switched her major to oncology, determined to help other families facing the same battles her own had overcome. "Penny for your thoughts?" a voice beside her asked. Arya turned to find Mrs. Holbrook, looking uncharacteristically festive in a floral dress. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Arya replied, gesturing to the happy scene before them. "A year ago I never could have imagined this." Mrs. Holbrook nodded sagely. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? But you, my dear, you were the catalyst for all of this. Your strength, your determination, you brought this family back together." Arya felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "I just did what I had to do for Mum. And in doing so, you healed more than just her illness," Mrs. Holbrook said softly. Before Arya could respond, Brock's voice rang out across the garden. "If I could have everyone's attention, please." The chatter died down as all eyes turned to the couple at the center of the gathering. Brock cleared his throat, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "First, I want to thank you all for being here today. This past year has been, well, it's been a journey to say the least." He paused, his eyes finding Arya in the crowd. "It's been a year of second chances, of healing old wounds and of creating new beginnings." Savannah squeezed his hand encouragingly, and Brock continued. 21 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life when I let this incredible woman walk away. I've spent every day since then regretting that decision, but fate, it seems, had other plans." He turned to Savannah, taking both of her hands in his. "Savannah, you gave me the greatest gift in our daughter, Arya, and now you've given me a second chance at love, at family, at the life we should have had all along." Brock dropped to one knee, and a collective gasp went up from the assembled guests. "I know we've done this all backwards, but Savannah Reeves, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streaming down her face, Savannah nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course I will." As applause erupted around them, Brock slipped a glittering diamond ring onto Savannah's finger and pulled her into a passionate kiss. Arya felt tears of joy welling up in her own eyes. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Constance Callahan standing beside her, a soft smile on the older woman's face. "You know," Constance said quietly, "I fought against this for so long. I was so worried about scandal, about what people would say. But seeing them now, seeing you, I realize how foolish I was. You are a true Callahan, Arya, and I'm proud to call you my granddaughter." Overwhelmed, Arya hugged her grandmother tightly. As they parted, Savannah called out, "Arya, come here, sweetheart, we need you for this." Arya made her way through the crowd to her parents' side. Brock put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "None of this would have been possible without you, Arya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You brought us back together. You gave us all a second chance." "Oh, Dad," Arya said, the words still new and wonderful on her tongue. She hugged him tightly, then her mother, the three of them holding each other close as camera flashes went off around them. As the celebration continued into the evening, Arya found a quiet moment to slip away. She made her way to the old library, the room where her world had changed so dramatically a year ago. Running her fingers along the spines of the leather-bound books, she smiled to herself. Life, she realized, was a lot like the soap operas she and her mother used to watch together, full of twists and turns, joy and heartbreak, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, second chances and happy endings. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. "There you are," Savannah said, coming to stand beside her daughter. "Are you okay?" Arya nodded, linking her arm through her mother's. "Just thinking about how far we've come. Mom, are you happy? Really happy?" Savannah's smile was radiant. "Happier than I ever thought possible, sweetheart, and it's all because of you." As mother and daughter made their way back to the party, to the warmth of family and the promise of a bright future, Arya felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road hadn't been easy, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but together, as a family, they could face anything. In the end, their story wasn't just about second chances or long-lost love. It was about the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter, the healing power of forgiveness, and the beautiful, messy, wonderful journey of building a family not just by blood, but by choice. As the stars came out over Oakridge Manor, twinkling in the velvet sky, Arya raised her glass in a silent toast. To second chances, to love, to family, to the happy ending they'd all fought so hard to achieve, and the new beginning that lay ahead.